They were careless people. That's the phrase Sarah Wynn-Williams borrows from Fitzgerald to set the stage. Not careless in the way of forgetting your keys or missing a deadline, but careless in the way of people with power. People who move fast, break things, and rarely stop to pick up the pieces they leave behind. It's a story about where she used to work. But really, it's a story about what happens when ambition, technology, politics, and human frailty collide. The journey begins far away from Silicon Valley. Sarah was a kid growing up in Christchurch, New Zealand, ordinary enough, except for one extraordinary event that nearly ended her life before it had even begun. She was just 13 when a shark attacked her on a family holiday. One moment she was laughing in the surf with a friend. The next she was gripped by teeth, dragged under, and fighting for her life. She remembers the searing pain, the sensation of being pulled apart, the salt-stinging open flesh, the terrifying realization that the shark wasn't just trying to bite, it was trying to drown her. Most people would have given up, but Sarah fought, clawing and kicking until the animal released her. She staggered to shore, blood pouring into the water, and collapsed. What followed was a nightmarish series of near misses. An indifferent doctor, a family that thought she'd be fine, hours of agony, while her body filled with poison from torn bowels and collapsed lungs. At one point, she drifted so close to death that her parents began to prepare themselves for the worst. And then, through sheer willpower and a last-minute helicopter evacuation, she survived. Lying in a hospital bed after days in a coma, she scribbled a note to her mother, "I saved myself." It wasn't bravado, it was truth, and it became a defining part of her character. From then on, whenever faced with risk, with fear, with the choice to retreat or go forward, she went forward. If life was fragile, she wasn't going to waste it. That brush with death sparked a conviction that she had to do something meaningful, something bigger than herself. In her 20s, that meant diplomacy. She worked for New Zealand at the United Nations, diving into treaties on biodiversity, oceans, climate change. She believed in protecting the planet, believed in the machinery of international cooperation. But the longer she stayed, the more disillusioned she became. Endless arguments over punctuation in documents no one would ever read, late-night debates that seemed to move nothing forward, and the quiet realization that sometimes a cartoon fish like Finding Nemo had done more for ocean awareness than years of UN negotiations. By the late 2000s, Sarah found herself in Washington, D.C., at the New Zealand Embassy. It was important work, but once again she felt on the margins. New Zealand was respected, sure, but also dismissed as harmless, a country no one thought could alter global power. She wanted to be at the center of the action, where change was actually happening. And then she stumbled across something that felt revolutionary. It wasn't a treaty or a government. It was a website, Facebook. At first, it was personal, a way to connect with friends and family back home, to see photos, to share little scraps of life. But as Sarah scrolled, she began to see something bigger. Politicians were showing up, talking directly to citizens. Communities were forming, information flowing. It struck her that this wasn't just a social network. It was a political one. And if politics was going to happen on Facebook, then the people who ran it would be setting the rules of a new kind of global conversation. She became convinced, evangelical really, that Facebook was going to change the world. The sheer amount of data it was collecting was unprecedented. Information about everyone, everywhere. Governments would inevitably want to control it. Battles would be fought over it. And whoever shaped those rules would shape the future. Sarah decided she wanted to be part of that revolution. Not on the sidelines, not as a distant observer, but inside. She imagined herself as a diplomat for Facebook, helping the company navigate governments, protecting it, guiding it, even defending it when necessary. The problem? No such job existed, so she created one. Tracking down contacts, she pitched her vision to anyone who would listen. Finally, she managed to get in front of Martin Levine, Facebook's new vice president of global public policy. Sarah explained that Facebook needed a diplomat, someone to anticipate conflicts, to think globally, to prepare for the battles over data, privacy, speech, and power that were sure to come. Levine listened politely, then dismissed her. What Facebook needed, she said, was people who understood US regulation. The rest could wait. It might have ended there. But Sarah didn't give up. She called again, wrote again, pitched again. When an earthquake devastated her hometown of Christchurch in 2011, she saw firsthand how Facebook became a lifeline. People checking on loved ones, sharing updates, organizing resources. That disaster and the role the platform played deepened her conviction. She told Facebook, "This is your power. You're not just connecting people for fun. You're becoming the infrastructure of society." Eventually, persistence paid off. She was offered a job, manager of global public policy. Even then, her bosses admitted they weren't sure it was a real job. But Sarah didn't care. She had a foot in the door. The adventure had begun. From the start, Facebook felt unlike anything she had known. The offices were messy, youthful, littered with Nerf guns and energy drinks. Mark Zuckerberg was there, but he seemed uninterested in politics. Sheryl Sandberg, the chief operating officer, was the one who engaged with policy and governments. Sarah's task was to carve out a role in a place that didn't fully understand why her work mattered. One of her first big assignments was to help host New Zealand's Prime Minister at Facebook headquarters. It should have been straightforward, one head of state meeting another leader. But Zuckerberg didn't want to meet him. Politics wasn't his thing. Sarah scrambled, persuading other executives to step in, smoothing egos, learning quickly that at Facebook, protocol meant little. What mattered was growth, metrics, user numbers. Governments were useful only insofar as they could help or hinder that mission. Still, the work was intoxicating. She was part of a tiny team, shaping the way one of the most powerful companies on Earth interacted with the world. She traveled constantly, meeting ministers, negotiating rules, sometimes improvising wildly. There were moments of comedy, like trying to sneak Zuckerberg into better seating at a bizarre state dinner in Panama, only to end up running through a tunnel full of horses. There were moments of awe, seeing world leaders pay attention, realizing how much weight Facebook carried. And there were moments of unease, watching how casually decisions were made, how little thought went into consequences that might ripple globally. In those early years, Sarah still believed in the mission. Facebook was growing at breakneck speed, and she felt she was helping it grow responsibly. She imagined herself as a bridge between Silicon Valley and the world of governments, trying to make sure the revolution unfolded with at least some measure of wisdom. But beneath the excitement, cracks were forming. The culture inside Facebook was relentlessly focused on growth, getting more users, more engagement, more data. Everything else was secondary. When she suggested building councils of outside experts, she was told no. When she raised concerns about global risks, executives waved them off. "We make the decisions," they said. Slowly, Sarah began to notice a pattern. Carelessness, not negligence exactly, more like willful blindness. A refusal to look too closely at the consequences. It was easier not to. And that carelessness wasn't just inside the company. It was becoming the culture of the internet itself. She watched as Facebook became entangled in the Arab Spring, as activists used it to organize uprisings, and governments struggled to respond. Should the company take credit? Should it stay silent? Should it intervene? Sarah argued for caution, for foresight. But the instinct inside Facebook was always to move fast, to ride the wave, to avoid slowing down for messy questions. For Sarah, the shark attack years earlier had taught her that survival often depends on facing fear head-on. At Facebook, she saw the opposite. Survival meant ignoring the fear, brushing it aside, and charging forward regardless. First, she told herself this was just growing pains. Every young company made mistakes. Every revolution was messy. But as the years went on, she realized the mess was not incidental. It was the business model. And that's where part one leaves us. With Sarah inside the machine, hopeful but uneasy, caught between the thrill of being at the center of something world-changing and the nagging suspicion that the carelessness she saw around her wasn't going away, it was only going to grow. In the early days, Sarah Wynn-Williams still believed the carelessness could be corrected. That if people like her kept raising questions, kept pushing for thoughtful policies, Facebook might grow up into the kind of company that deserved its influence. But as the years passed, the stakes grew higher, and the willingness to slow down or change course shrank. She watched as the platform expanded into countries with fragile democracies, weak institutions, volatile politics. The growth was explosive, but the infrastructure to handle it simply didn't exist. Content moderators were underpaid contractors in far-off places, with little training and impossible workloads. Rules were applied inconsistently. Governments complained. Users complained. Inside Facebook, the default response was to tinker at the edges, issue vague statements, and move on. Sarah began to see how decisions made in California, sometimes in a single meeting, sometimes in a single email, could reverberate across entire nations. A change to an algorithm might destabilize political discourse. A new feature might inflame ethnic tensions. But inside the company, those outcomes were often invisible. The dashboards tracked engagement, not consequences. One moment that stuck with her was watching executives discuss how to respond to a crisis in Myanmar. Reports were emerging that Facebook had been used to incite violence against the Rohingya, a persecuted Muslim minority. United Nations investigators were calling it a human rights catastrophe. Yet in the meetings Sarah attended, the tone was oddly detached. People spoke in the language of PR risk, not moral urgency. "What's our messaging?" someone asked. "What's the timeline for response?" The underlying question, "What have we done?" barely surfaced. Over time, Sarah saw how carelessness became normalized. Not because people were evil, but because the incentives pointed in one direction: growth, speed, dominance. If something went wrong, the instinct was to contain the fallout, not examine the system. She watched colleagues burn out, silenced or sidelined when they pushed too hard for change. She watched how Sheryl Sandberg managed the public image of the company with precision, but avoided confronting some of the deeper structural problems. She saw Mark Zuckerberg begin to reckon with the idea that Facebook might have helped elect Donald Trump, but only after the fact and only briefly. There were moments when Sarah felt like she was back in that ocean, gripped by a force larger than herself, struggling to keep her head above water. The difference was that now the danger wasn't a shark. It was a culture that prized disruption over deliberation, connection over truth, engagement over well-being. Still, she stayed. Partly because she believed in the original mission, partly because she hoped things could improve from the inside, and partly because, like so many others, she was caught in the current. The job was prestigious. The travel was exhilarating. The access to power was intoxicating. But slowly, her hope eroded. She saw how authoritarian governments were courted, how compromises were made to gain market share, how difficult questions were deferred or ignored. She realized that the revolution she had imagined, the one where technology made the world more open and connected, was turning into something else entirely. And she realized something even more painful. The carelessness wasn't a bug. It was the system working as designed. By the time Sarah left Facebook, the company was facing public backlash on multiple fronts. Disinformation, election interference, hate speech, data privacy scandals. Politicians were calling for regulation. Journalists were investigating. Former employees were speaking out. From the outside, it might have looked like a reckoning. But Sarah knew how deeply entrenched the culture was. The instinct to deflect, to deny, to delay, that was still strong. The same executives who had waved off concerns years earlier were now testifying before Congress, apologizing without really changing. When she reflected on her time at the company, Sarah didn't see villains. She saw something more complex and in some ways more troubling. She saw people who believed they were doing good, but who lacked the humility to question their own impact. She saw a culture that rewarded boldness and punished doubt. She saw how easy it was, inside that bubble, to believe that connecting people was always inherently positive. And she saw how easily carelessness could scale. The title of her book, Careless People, is a nod to the Great Gatsby. In that novel, Tom and Daisy Buchanan wreak havoc on the lives around them, then retreat into their wealth and privilege, leaving others to clean up the mess. Sarah saw a similar dynamic at Facebook, not because anyone set out to cause harm, but because when the harm became undeniable, the response was to retreat, to issue statements, hire crisis consultants, and carry on. She also saw her own complicity. She had been part of the machine. She had argued for its value, defended its choices, helped it expand. She had believed in the mission, even when the evidence was mounting that the mission was flawed. Writing the book was, in part, her way of reckoning with that, of telling the truth even if it was uncomfortable, of naming the carelessness for what it was. The story she tells isn't just about Facebook. It's about the broader culture of tech, the seductive idea that moving fast and breaking things is inherently virtuous, that innovation justifies disruption, that scale excuses oversight. It's about how easy it is, in a system built on speed and ambition, to lose sight of the human cost. And it's about the quiet voices inside those systems, the ones who notice, who worry, who try to raise the alarm. The ones who, like Sarah, eventually have to decide whether to stay and fight or walk away. In the end, Sarah chose to leave. She had survived a shark attack. She had survived the United Nations. And she had survived Facebook. But survival wasn't enough. She wanted to live with integrity. She wanted to tell the story, not just to settle scores, but to make sense of what she had seen. Her book is an invitation to reflect, to ask what carelessness looks like in our own lives, our own institutions, our own choices. To recognize that the systems we build, whether in tech, politics, or business, are shaped by human decisions, and that those decisions matter. It's also a reminder that revolutions don't always go the way we hope, that the tools we create can empower and harm in equal measure. That connection without responsibility can become chaos. Careless People is not a bitter book. It's a clear-eyed one. It doesn't offer easy answers. It doesn't suggest that Facebook is uniquely evil or that technology is inherently bad. But it does insist on accountability, on the need to pause, to reflect, to care. Sarah Wynn-Williams left Facebook with her eyes wide open. She knows that telling the story won't fix everything, but she also knows that silence won't either. And so she speaks, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is bear witness, to name what we've seen, to learn from it, and to do better next time. If there is a single question that echoes through the pages of her memoir, it is this: when the future looks back at us, will they call us careful or careless? That question lingers, and maybe that's the point.